Most Omegas spend their wedding night trembling on a king-sized mattress draped in silk, waiting to be torn apart or claimed. I was sitting at a heavily carved mahogany desk on the top floor of a Manhattan penthouse, crossing out numbers with a red fountain pen. The silk shirt Arthur had forced me into was suffocating, itching violently against the scent blockers plastered over my gland. The collar was too tight. The sleeves were too short. It was Oliver's shirt. The ledger in front of me, however, was an absolute catastrophe. The Cross family might run the most ruthless mafia syndicate in New York, but their money laundering system looked like it was managed by a concussed chimpanzee. A decimal point was misplaced on page 42. A blatant skimming operation was hiding behind a fake import company in Queens, hemorrhaging roughly 15% of their quarterly profits. My fingers twitched. My OCD couldn't handle it. The red ink bled through the expensive paper as I slashed through another fabricated expense. Oliver wouldn't have noticed. My twin brother, the golden boy, the perfect compliant Omega, who smelled like a walking peach orchard. Oliver would have been crying on the bed right now, terrified of the monster our father sold him to. But Oliver was currently on a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles, clutching a one-way ticket I bought him with stolen cash. He thought he was escaping. He didn't realize I orchestrated his flight just so I could take his place in the carriage. I didn't want the Cross family's protection. I wanted their bank accounts. The heavy oak doors to the study didn't just open, they were shoved inward with enough force to crack the plaster. The air pressure in the room immediately collapsed. I didn't look up right away. I smelled him first. There was no romanticized sandalwood or pine. Victor Cross smelled like a violent static electrical storm. It was the sharp, biting tang of ozone cold gun oil and pure concentrated aggression. It hit the back of my throat like a physical blow, making my defective scent gland throb painfully beneath the patch. You have exactly 3 seconds to tell me why you smell like a burnout printing press instead of a peach orchard, or I am going to break your neck. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble that shook the floorboards. I carefully placed the cap back on the red fountain pen. I aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of the ledger. Only then did I look up. Victor was a massive shadow in the doorway. He was wearing a dark suit, the tie already discarded, looking less like a groom and more like an executioner. His pale, icy eyes locked onto mine effortlessly, stripping away the cheap pheromone spray my father had doused me in. He knew. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, silent strides. I didn't flinch, not even when the cold steel barrel of a Glock 19 was pressed directly against the center of my forehead. The metallic sound of the safety being flicked off echoed in the silent room. Oliver Vance is currently crossing state lines, I said. My voice was raspy, devoid of the sweet, submissive lilt alphas expected. Arthur didn't want to lose the bridal price, so he dressed me in my brother's clothes and hoped you wouldn't notice until the ink on the contract was dry. Victor's jaw tightened. The ozone scent spiked, smelling like a blown transformer. It was suffocating. Arthur is a dead man, and you are a corpse keeping his seat warm. Maybe, I replied, ignoring the cold metal digging into my skin. I reached out with my scarred, calloused fingers that had spent years scrubbing diner grills and balancing illicit books, not playing the piano. I slowly spun the heavily redacted ledger around, pushing it across the polished oak toward him. Victor's eyes flicked down to the open pages, taking in the sea of angry red ink. But before you pull that trigger, I continued, keeping my breathing painfully even. You should know that your capo in Brooklyn is skimming off the top of your casino revenue. 15%. He is masking it through a shell corporation listed as a waste management facility. You have lost $3 million in the last 2 quarters alone. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the distant, mournful wail of a police siren down on the Manhattan streets. I am a defective Omega. I don't smell sweet, I don't submit, and I will absolutely ruin your Egyptian cotton sheets, I said, leaning an inch forward into the gun. But I can fix that ledger. I can track every single blood-soaked penny in this city and put it directly into your vault. I stared into the eyes of the most dangerous alpha in New York, letting my own dark ambition bleed through. So pull the trigger, Victor, or put the gun down and let me get your $3 million back. The tension stretched, pulled taut like a piano wire about to snap. Victor stared at me. He looked at my clenched jaw, my complete lack of tears, and the meticulously aligned red pen on the desk. Slowly, a dark, terrifying smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't warm, it was the thrill of the predator finding a new kind of prey. He lowered the gun. "You smell like old paper and spite," Victor murmured, his voice laced with dark amusement. He reached out his heavy, scarred thumb, deliberately pressing into my bruised scent gland, sending a jarring jolt of electricity straight down my spine. "Fix the ledger, little snake. If you miss a single cent, I will bury you under it." I exhaled slowly, watching him walk toward the whiskey decanter. I had survived the night. Now the real hostile takeover begins. The front was called Empire Waste Management. It smelled exactly like the name implied, a suffocating cocktail of diesel fuel damp cardboard and the cheap, overpowering body spray of low-level mob enforcers. My desk was a chipped laminate monstrosity shoved into the corner of a windowless Brooklyn basement. The Cross family thought this was a demotion. They thought tossing me into the lowest rung of their financial food chain was a punishment for a mouthy, defective Omega who dared to negotiate at gunpoint. They didn't realize they had just handed a pyromaniac the keys to an armory. The ledgers in front of me were a physical assault on my senses. Coffee stains on balance sheets, misaligned columns, expenses recorded with the precision of a blindfolded toddler. My skin crawled. The itch started at the base of my skull, a frantic, vibrating biological need to impose absolute order on the chaos. I didn't eat lunch. I didn't blink. I uncapped my red fountain pen and went to war. By 4 p.m. on Tuesday, my fingers were stained crimson, and I had mapped out the diseased financial arteries of the Brooklyn operation. That was when I found it. It wasn't a glaring hole. Mob accountants were stupid, but they weren't completely suicidal. It was a microscopic fracture, a 0.05% variance in the payout margins of the underground casino in Hell's Kitchen. To a normal person, it was a rounding error. To my violently obsessive brain, it was a siren blaring in an empty room. I followed the digital breadcrumbs, cross-referencing the misplaced decimal points with supply invoices. It led to a shell company registered in Delaware, which funneled weekly deposits to an offshore account in the Caymans. The account holder wasn't a Cross. It was a subsidiary tied to Lorenzo Rossi Victor's biggest rival in New York. Someone inside this room was feeding the Rossi syndicate. "Hey, sweetheart." The voice was a guttural, condescending scrape against my eardrums. I didn't look up carefully, tracing a red line beneath a fraudulent routing number. Marcus stepped into my peripheral vision. He was a capo with more muscle mass than brain cells, built like a brick wall, and smelling offensively of sour sweat and testosterone. He slammed a heavy, calloused hand flat on my desk, deliberately knocking over my meticulously organized stack of invoices. I stared at the scattered papers. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. "The boss might let you play house in the penthouse," Marcus sneered, leaning in. He deliberately released a wave of alpha pheromones, a suffocating, aggressive pressure designed to make Omegas bare their throats and whimper. "But down here, you are just a glorified secretary keeping a chair warm. So fetch me a black coffee before I remind you how a real alpha treats a defective bitch." I didn't shrink back. The pheromones were repulsive, yes, but they were nothing compared to the cold, paralyzing terror of Victor Cross's ozone. Marcus wasn't a predator. He was just a yapping dog looking for a bone. I carefully placed the cap back on my red pen. I aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. Then I slowly picked up a single sheet of paper from the mess he had made. It was the transaction log for the Hell's Kitchen casino. "Do you know what this is, Marcus?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. I stood up, smoothing the paper flat. "I thought you only knew how to read picture books," he mocked, though his eyes darted nervously to the numbers. "This is your death warrant," I said softly. I shoved the paper directly against his chest, forcing him to take it, or let it fall. "You approved the routing numbers for the casino's offshore deposits. You missed a 0.05% skimming operation feeding directly to the Rossi syndicate. Or maybe you didn't miss it. Maybe you are the one taking a cut to look the other way." Marcus went pale. The arrogant alpha scent instantly soured into the distinct, pathetic stench of raw panic. "You are lying," he choked out, raising a massive fist. "I will snap your neck, you little coward." "Try it." The voice didn't come from me. It came from the shadows near the doorway. The air pressure in the room vanished. The smell of cheap cologne and sweat was instantly obliterated by the crushing, freezing scent of a violent electrical storm. Victor stepped into the flickering fluorescent light. He wore a tailored black overcoat, looking less like a Mafia don and more like a god of death who had decided to grace a Brooklyn basement with his presence. He hadn't just arrived. The long column of ash on his cigarette meant he had been standing there for a while, watching. Marcus dropped his fist as if his arm had been severed. He stumbled backward, his knees practically buckling under the sheer suffocating dominance radiating from Victor. "Don, Victor under the Omega is making things up. He doesn't know what he is talking about." Victor ignored him. He walked past the trembling capo, his pale, icy eyes fixed entirely on me. He looked at my ink-stained fingers, the scattered but lethal files, and the bloodless, terrifying calm in my eyes. "Is it accurate?" Victor asked me, his voice a low, vibrating hum that settled deep in my chest. "To the last cent," I replied, holding his gaze without flinching. Victor took a slow drag from his cigarette. He finally looked at Marcus, his expression completely blank. "Take him to the meat locker," he ordered the two silent enforcers standing in the hall. Marcus began to scream. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, a desperate begging for mercy, as he was dragged away by his collar. I didn't bat an eye. I just picked up my fallen invoices and tapped them against the desk to align the edges. The room fell silent again, save for the hum of the overhead lights. Victor reached out his leather-gloved finger, tracing the edge of my ruined ledger. "You are wasting your talents in a basement. Julian," he murmured, the heavy ozone scent wrapping around me, distinctly territorial and possessive. "Pack up your red pens. I'm having a desk moved into my study." I looked at the man who had just sentenced a capo to death, based entirely on my math. I didn't feel fear. I felt a twisted, euphoric sense of purpose. The real hostile takeover was about to begin. Victor Cross's private study became my war room. It was a cavernous space on the penthouse floor, walled with first edition books and bulletproof glass that overlooked the glittering, jagged skyline of Manhattan. My desk, a sleek slab of black glass and steel, was positioned exactly 10 feet away from Victor's massive mahogany desk. I didn't just balance the books anymore, I built a financial guillotine. My target was Arthur Vance, the man who shared my blood, the man who sold my twin brother, and the man who thought he could discard me like a broken tool. I didn't send hitmen after him. That was too quick, too merciful. Instead, I systematically dismantled his life through the Cayman Island accounts. I bought up his gambling markers from the Russians. I froze his offshore shell companies. I strangled his credit lines until he couldn't even buy a cup of coffee without my silent permission. I was burying my father alive under a mountain of negative equity. Days bled into nights. There were no romantic dinners, no forced consummations of our marriage contract. There was only the thick silence of the study, broken by the scratch of my red fountain pen and the metallic clicking sounds of Victor disassembling and cleaning his firearms. We existed in a bizarre symbiotic orbit. I lived on black coffee, and Spite Victor lived on violence and control. Yet the air in the room was never suffocating. The crushing dominant ozone of his pheromones, which had terrified me on our wedding night, gradually became a white noise that I relied on. It was a static field that kept my frantic, OCD-riddled brain tethered to reality. My logic, my obsessive need for numerical order, seemed to act as an anchor for the monster living under Victor's skin. I realized the dynamic had irrevocably shifted on a Thursday evening when Victor returned from a sit-down with the five families. He walked into the study, shrugging off his tailored suit jacket. He looked exhausted, the faint smell of gunpowder and other alpha's aggressive pheromones clinging to his clothes. But underneath the stench of the outside world, there was something else. Roman, who had followed him in to deliver a briefing, stopped dead in his tracks. The capo sniffed the air, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. "Boss," Roman muttered, glancing nervously between Victor and me. "You smell like a printing press. And old paper." Victor didn't flinch. He walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured 2 glasses of scotch, sliding one across my desk. "It is called a ledger, Roman." Victor said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "It means my house is in order. It means the brain of this family has marked me. If anyone at the commission has a problem with how I smell, they can take it up with my consigliere." I stopped writing. The red ink bled slightly into the page. Consigliere. He didn't call me his omega. He called me his advisor, his equal. Roman swallowed hard, nodded sharply, and excused himself. I stared at the amber liquid in my glass. I had a defective scent gland. I smelled like ash, bitter citrus, and ink. I was biologically incapable of marking an alpha, yet the most dangerous man in New York was wearing my scent like a badge of honor, a silent warning to the underworld that his mind belonged to me. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it made the dark, hollow ache in my chest recede just a fraction. But trauma is a patient predator. It doesn't strike when you are weak, it strikes when you finally let your guard down. It happened at 3:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. The city below was silent, shrouded in a heavy downpour. I was deep in the archives of Arthur's personal expenses from 5 years ago, tracing a diverted fund. And then I saw it. Line item 402, August 12th. Deduction $12,500. Note medical disposal, liability termination. The numbers stopped making sense. They began to crawl off the page like black insects. August the 12th. That was the day my mother died in a sterile, underfunded hospice room because Arthur refused to pay for her life support. He hadn't just let her die, he had written off the cost of pulling her plug as a corporate liability termination to save on his quarterly taxes. A sharp, high-pitched ringing pierced my ears. The air in the study vanished. My fingers clamped around the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles popped. The faint, bitter smell of burnt sugar, my distress pheromone, flooded the room sour and pathetic. I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved violently, but my lungs refused to expand. I was back in that hospital room, smelling the bleach, feeling the cold, listening to the flatline. $12,500. That was what a human life was worth. That was the math. It was wrong. The ledger was unbalanced. I have to fix it. I have to fix the numbers. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled for my red pen. I dragged it across the paper, but my vision was completely blurred by hot, stinging tears. I was hyperventilating, a pathetic, broken sound escaping my throat. Julian. The voice cut through the ringing, but I couldn't process it. The panic attack had fully consumed me. I was drowning in the ink. A shadow fell over my desk. Victor didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to calm down. Instead, the room exploded with the scent of a violent electrical storm. But it wasn't an attack. The heavy, crackling ozone wrapped around me like a weighted blanket, instantly grounding the chaotic static in my brain. The sheer dominance of his pheromones forcibly pushed the panic out of my lungs, commanding my biology to breathe. Victor stepped behind my chair. He didn't grab my shaking shoulders. He reached over me, his massive, scarred chest pressing lightly against my back. His heat was a physical shock to my freezing skin. He reached down and gently covered my trembling right hand with his own. His fingers were rough, calloused from pulling triggers, but his touch was incredibly precise. He guided my hand, gripping the red fountain pen. The math is wrong. I choked out a raw, humiliating sob breaking past my lips. He wrote her off. He balanced the sheet with her. I know. Victor murmured, his voice a deep, vibrating rumble against my spine. So we correct it. With his hand firmly over mine, Victor guided the pen. He didn't just cross out the $12,500. He pressed the nib down so hard it tore through the expensive paper, violently slashing a thick, bleeding red line through Arthur's name, through the date, through the entire memory. He is a ghost, Julian, Victor whispered, leaning down so his lips brushed against my ear. The smell of gunmetal and ozone completely enveloped me, safe and terrifying all at once. And ghosts don't get a line on my ledger. You are a cross now. We deal in blood, not grief. I stared at the ruined page. My erratic heartbeat slowly began to synchronize with the slow, steady thud of Victor's heart behind me. He didn't pull away when the panic subsided. He stayed there, his hand resting over mine, the red ink drying on our fingers. In that quiet, rain-soaked study, the last fragile boundary between the Mafia Don and his defective Omega shattered. I realized I wasn't just working for Victor Cross. I belonged to him, and heaven help anyone who tried to take him from me. The Queen's shipping port smelled like rotting kelp, diesel exhaust, and rusted iron. It was a far cry from the sterile, temperature-controlled environment of the penthouse study. The icy wind coming off the East River bit through the collar of my dark wool coat, but I didn't seek shelter. I stood under the harsh glare of a halogen floodlight, holding a heavy clipboard. I was cross-referencing the serial numbers of a textile shipment against the digital manifest on my tablet. My breath plumed in the freezing air. Variance is 0. The manifest matches the physical inventory, I muttered, uncapping my red fountain pen to sign off on the delivery. Roman, standing a few feet away with an assault rifle slung across his chest, let out a tight breath. Good. The boss wants this moved to the Brooklyn warehouse before dawn. Let us pack it up, Julian. It is too exposed out here. He was right, but my brain demanded completion. I needed to finish the final tally. I pressed the nib of my pen to the paper. I never got to sign my name. It started with a sound like a heavy steel door slamming shut. A split second later, the halogen floodlight above me shattered into a million pieces, plunging the dock into immediate chaotic darkness. Ambush! Roman roared. Protect the consigliere. The world erupted. The deafening, rhythmic sound of automatic gunfire tore through the freezing night. The sound was physical punching into my eardrums and vibrating in my teeth. Sparks showered from the steel shipping containers as bullets ricocheted off the metal. Someone tackled me hard around the waist. I hit the wet, freezing asphalt, the impact driving the air from my lungs. My tablet shattered the glass screen, exploding outward. "Keep your head down," a cross enforcer yelled, dragging me behind the thick steel corner of a container. A second later, the enforcer's head snapped back. A spray of warm, metallic-smelling liquid hit the side of my face. He collapsed dead before he hit the ground. Panic cold and sharp flooded my veins. This wasn't a spreadsheet. This wasn't a fraudulent routing number I could cross out with red ink. A 9mm hollow point didn't care about logic. It didn't care about a balanced ledger. For all my calculated arrogance, I was just a fragile, weaponless Omega, pinned down in a crossfire. The Rossi Syndicate had figured it out. They realized who had been strangling their supply lines, freezing their accounts, and starving their capos. They didn't come to steal the cargo. They came to cut off the head of Victor Cross's financial empire. They came for me. I crawled backward, my hand scraping against the rough asphalt. My clipboard was lying 3 feet away, the crisp white paperwork rapidly soaking up the pooling blood of the dead enforcer. The red ink of my unfinished signature bled into the crimson. Footsteps crunched on broken glass. 3 men holding suppressed submachine guns stepped around the corner of the container. They weren't wearing cross-family colors. The leader grinned his eyes, locking on to my terrified face. "Checkmate, accountant," he sneered, raising the barrel of his gun. I didn't close my eyes. I refused to die like a coward. I stared down the barrel, bracing for the impact. But the shot never came. Instead, the freezing wind coming off the river suddenly stopped. The ambient smell of diesel and salt water was instantly obliterated by a violent, suffocating wave of crackling ozone. It was so intense it tasted like battery acid on the back of my tongue. A shadow dropped from the top of the shipping container. Victor didn't use a gun. He landed directly on the leader, the sheer force of his massive frame driving the man into the concrete with a sickening sound of shattering bone. The other 2 Rossi gunmen panicked, swinging their weapons wildly. They didn't stand a chance. Victor moved with a terrifying, predatory blur. He wasn't a Don in a tailored suit right now. He was the apex monster of New York let off the leash. He grabbed the nearest gunman by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one hand before violently snapping his neck. He drew a combat knife with his free hand and buried it to the hilt under the jaw of the third man. In less than 5 seconds, all 3 men were dead. The gunfire on the docks abruptly died down as Victor's reinforcements flooded the area, securing the perimeter, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Victor stood slowly amidst the carnage. His dark overcoat was ruined. His hands were slick with fresh blood. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, the air around him violently vibrating with enraged alpha pheromones. He turned and looked at me. I was still sitting on the wet asphalt, paralyzed. The blood of his enforcer was smeared across my cheek. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't feel my fingers. Victor dropped his bloody knife. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides and fell to his knees on the hard concrete right in front of me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He grabbed my face with his massive blood-soaked hands, his thumbs desperately wiping across my cheek to find the source of the blood. "It is not mine." I choked out, my voice cracking. "I am not hit." A shuddering breath ripped out of Victor's chest. The crushing, enraged static of his scent immediately softened, wrapping around me like a heavy protective shield. He pulled me forward, crushing my chest against his tactical vest. The smell of copper gunpowder and his overwhelming ozone enveloped me. I buried my face into his shoulder, my fingers gripping the thick fabric of his coat like a lifeline. "They came for you." Victor growled, his voice a lethal vibrating rumble against my ear. Rossi thought he could win the war by taking my brain. I miscalculated. I whispered the adrenaline crash, making my teeth chatter. I pushed them too far into a corner financially. I didn't account for a direct physical retaliation. I made a mistake. Victor pulled back slightly, forcing me to look into his pale, icy eyes. There was a bloody smear across his jaw, making him look demonic beautiful and absolutely terrifying. "You didn't make a mistake, Julian," he murmured. "You forced their hand. You brought them out of the shadows." He reached down, his bloodied fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair out of my eyes. "You think I don't know," Victor whispered, the dark amusement returning to his voice, entirely out of place in the slaughterhouse. You think my people didn't track the stolen cash that bought Oliver's Greyhound ticket to Los Angeles? My breath hitched. The cold air in my lungs froze completely. I stared at him, my heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. He knew the whole time. You set a trap, Julian. Victor continued softly, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, smearing Rossi blood onto my pale skin. You manipulated Arthur, you orchestrated the switch, and you walked into my penthouse with a red pen and a death wish, intending to use my empire to annihilate your father. And you let me. I breathed stunned. Victor smiled. It was a dark, chilling expression that made my soul shiver. I let you, Victor agreed, because a compliant, sweet-smelling Omega is a liability. But a creature who can look down the barrel of my gun and offer me a blood-soaked ledger, that is a partner. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, tasting of ash and violence. I walked into your trap, Julian, because I wanted the monster waiting inside it. I stared at the dawn of the Cross family. My hands finally stopped shaking. The terror receded, replaced by a dark, consuming fire. I wasn't a hostage playing a dangerous game anymore. I reached up my scarred hands, gripping the lapels of his ruined coat, pulling him back down into the blood and the rain. The hot water of the penthouse shower did nothing to wash away the phantom smell of copper and bone dust. I stood under the scalding spray until my skin turned a patchy, inflamed red. The blood of the Rossi enforcer was gone from my cheek, spiraling down the drain, but I still felt it. I felt the wet, heavy weight of death clinging to my pores. I stepped out of the glass enclosure and wiped the condensation off the massive mirror. The face staring back at me didn't look like a victim anymore. My eyes were hollow hard and terrifyingly cold. I traced the line of my jaw, the same jawline Arthur possessed. I was a Vance. For all my self-righteous hatred of my father, I had just used a Mafia Don to slaughter 3 men without losing a wink of sleep. I had orchestrated a financial famine that starved dozens of Russi's low-level soldiers, leaving their families destitute. I wasn't a righteous avenger. I was a parasite who had just climbed higher up the food chain. I was turning into Arthur. A sudden violent wave of nausea hit me. I gripped the edges of the marble vanity, my knuckles turning white, gasping for air. The bitter, sour scent of burnt sugar, my distress pheromone leaked into the sterile air of the bathroom, weak but undeniable. Stop it. The voice was a low, commanding rumble that vibrated through the marble floor. Victor was leaning against the bathroom door frame. He had stripped off his ruined tactical vest and blood-soaked shirt, standing bare-chested in the dim light. A map of faded, jagged scars crisscrossed his torso, a testament to a lifetime of surviving the abyss. His pale eyes were locked onto my pale, panicked face in the mirror. I am exactly like him. I choked out, unable to look away from my own reflection. Arthur sold his son to save his skin. I manipulated a war to burn his life down. There is no difference. I am a monster playing with a calculator. Victor didn't offer a soft denial. He didn't tell me I was a good person. He pushed off the doorframe, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He grabbed my shoulders, his large, calloused hands warm against my damp skin, and forcibly turned me around to face him. The overwhelming scent of an electrical storm instantly enveloped me, suppressing the sour panic in the air. Do not insult yourself by comparing your intellect to Arthur's cowardice. Victor growled, his thumbs pressing deeply into my collarbones, grounding me to the floor. Arthur used people because he was weak. You destroyed an empire because you are a survivor. You protected what was yours. I used you. I whispered, my voice breaking. Victor's lips curled into a predatory, breathtaking smile. And I let you. Do you think a goddamn spreadsheet could bend me to its will if I didn't want to be bent? He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. The heat radiating off his body was intoxicating, melting the ice in my veins. You aren't a parasite, Julian, Victor murmured, his voice dropping into a rough, intimate cadence. You are an apex predator who finally found his hunting grounds. You were born for this dark. You were born for me. Never apologize for having fangs. The heavy, crushing truth of his words settled into my bones. He saw the darkest, ugliest parts of my soul, the obsessive control, the ruthlessness, the lack of empathy for our enemies, and he didn't just accept them, he worshipped them. Come with me, Victor ordered softly. He handed me a silk robe. I tied it around my waist and followed him out of the bathroom, leaving the phantom blood behind. We didn't go to the bedroom. Victor led me straight into the cavernous study. The storm outside had passed, leaving the Manhattan skyline glittering like scattered diamonds against the black glass. Victor walked past my desk and moved to the far wall where an original Rembrandt hung in heavy shadow. He pulled the painting aside, revealing a massive biometric steel vault. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a deep mechanical clanking sound. He didn't pull out cash. He didn't pull out weapons. Victor pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio and carried it to his mahogany desk. He dropped it onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. "Open it," he commanded, standing on the opposite side of the desk. I hesitated, the scent of old paper and ink immediately sparking my obsessive instincts. I stepped forward and flipped the heavy leather cover open. My breath caught in my throat. They were master deeds, transfer of ownership forms, irrevocable power of attorney documents, offshore routing protocols. It was the legal and financial skeleton of the entire Cross Syndicate's legitimate holdings, the real estate, the shell corporations, the shipping ports, the holding companies, billions of dollars. Every single document had Victor's signature at the bottom. The line for the beneficiary, the sole controller of the empire, was blank. Next to the portfolio, Victor placed a solid gold fountain pen. I looked up at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Victor, what is this?" "That is my throat, Julian," Victor said, his pale eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute intensity. "You sign those papers, and you own the Cross family's lifeblood. If you leave me, I am a beggar. If you betray me, I am dead." The air in the study vanished. The sheer unfathomable magnitude of what he was offering paralyzed me. In the Mafia, an Alpha Don trusted no one, not his blood, not his capos, and certainly not an Omega. Power was kept at the barrel of a gun. But Victor was handing me the nuclear codes. "Why?" I breathed out, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the desk. "I am a defective Omega. I am a Vance." "You are my consigliere," Victor corrected, his voice a low, vibrating hum of absolute devotion. "And you are my partner. I trust you more than I trust myself." I stared at the man who had just dismantled a hit squad with his bare hands, now willingly offering me the blade to cut his own throat. The last fragile wall guarding my cynical heart crumbled into dust. I picked up the pen. My hand stopped shaking. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the nib to the heavy parchment and signed my name in sharp, meticulously aligned strokes. Julian Cross. When the last page was signed, the study fell into a heavy, profound silence. The scent of ozone and ink mingled in the air, perfectly balanced, perfectly lethal. I closed the portfolio and slid it back across the desk. Then I walked over to my own black glass desk. I pulled out the red fountain pen. I opened the final ledger. Line by line, account by account, I drained the last remaining drops of Arthur Vance's hidden wealth. The Cayman accounts were frozen. The offshore trusts were legally seized under the Cross holding companies. The title to his suburban mansion was transferred to a demolition firm. I capped the red pen. I aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. "It is done," I said, looking across the room at my husband. "Arthur Vance's net worth is absolute zero. He legally does not exist." Victor smiled. It was a cold, beautiful expression. He reached for the encrypted landline on his desk and handed the receiver to me. "Then it is time to collect," Victor murmured. "Make the call, Julian. Bring your ghost into the light." The scent of fear is distinct. It doesn't smell like panic or adrenaline. It smells like stale sweat, unwashed hair, and sour desperation. When Roman and another enforcer dragged Arthur Vance into the penthouse study, that pathetic stench completely overpowered the sterile scent of the room. I was sitting behind my black glass desk, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting over a neat stack of manila folders. I didn't flinch when they threw my father onto the Persian rug. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the floor echoed in the quiet room. Arthur looked entirely unrecognizable. The tailored Italian suits and the arrogant aristocratic sneer were gone. He wore a rumpled, stained dress shirt. His hair was greasy and unkempt, his face pale and sunken. He looked exactly like what he was, a degenerate gambler who had just realized the house had taken everything. Victor stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the gray Manhattan sky, smoking a cigarette. He didn't even look at Arthur. He simply watched the smoke curl against the bulletproof glass. "Julian!" Arthur gasped, his voice a reedy, trembling wheeze. He scrambled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out toward my desk. "Julian, please. Tell him. Tell your husband to stop. They took the house. The banks locked me out. The Russians are calling my phone." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, expecting to see the terrified, defective Omega he had shoved into a Maybach just weeks ago. He expected to see a victim. I looked down at the man who had sold my twin brother to his death and treated me like a spare part. My heart didn't race. The air in my lungs didn't catch. I felt nothing but a cold, surgical precision. I picked up my red fountain pen. "Victor didn't do this. Arthur," I said quietly, my voice calm and devoid of any familial warmth. Arthur blinked confusion cutting through his panic. "What?" I used the nib of my pen to push the top manila folder across the smooth glass. It slid perfectly, stopping right at the edge of the desk, hovering over Arthur's face. "Victor didn't freeze the Cayman accounts," I explained smoothly, leaning back in my leather chair. "He didn't buy up your gambling markers from the Bratva, and he certainly didn't contact the IRS to trigger an audit on your offshore shell corporations. I did." Arthur stared at me, the color draining from his face until he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "It took exactly 3 weeks to dismantle 50 years of your arrogant, miserable life." I continued, my tone conversational, as if I were reviewing a quarterly report. "Your suburban estate was transferred to a cross-holding company for demolition. Your credit lines are frozen indefinitely. Every cent you ever hoarded, every bribe you ever took, has been legally and systemically drained. You are drowning in $30 million of debt that you will never, ever be able to repay." You are a freak." Arthur breathed out genuine terror, finally replacing the confusion. He scrambled backward, looking at me as if I were a demon wearing his son's skin. "You are a defective, insane freak. I am your father." "You were a liability," I corrected coldly. "And in this family, we balance the ledger." I capped my red pen with a sharp clicking sound. The sound made Arthur flinch violently. "I am not going to shoot you, Arthur," I said, looking down at his trembling form. "Death is too merciful. Death implies that you mattered. You are going to walk out of this building with the clothes on your back. You have no money, no identity, and no protection. You are going to live the rest of your miserable life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the debt collectors to break your kneecaps. You are legally a ghost." I looked up at the enforcers. "Get this trash out of my study." Roman didn't hesitate. He grabbed Arthur by the collar, dragging him backward as he began to sob and scream my name. The heavy oak doors opened and slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic wails. The study fell into a profound, ringing silence. I sat at my desk, my hands perfectly aligned. The ledger was balanced. The revenge I had kept myself alive for the fire that had fueled my obsessive survival was complete. And suddenly, a hollow, terrifying emptiness opened up in my chest. If I wasn't an avenger, if I wasn't the victim fighting back, who was? The vast empty space left behind by my hatred threatened to swallow me whole. My fingers twitched, a sudden spike of anxiety creeping into my throat. Footsteps broke the silence, heavy, deliberate, and predatory. Victor walked away from the window. The smell of cold ozone and smoke immediately flooded the room, wrapping around my sudden panic and forcibly anchoring me to the floor. He stopped in front of my desk, his massive frame blocking out the gray light of the city. He didn't offer a soft embrace. He reached across the desk and grabbed my left hand. I looked up startled. Victor pulled a ring out of his pocket. It wasn't a delicate wedding band. It wasn't an Omega's collar or a diamond meant to show off a pretty possession. It was a heavy, solid gold signet ring, deeply engraved with the crossed scythe crest of the Cross family. It was the mark of a consigliere, the second in command, the brain of the empire. Victor slid the heavy gold ring onto my index finger. The cold metal settled against my scarred skin, a perfect, absolute fit. "You burned down your past, Julian," Victor murmured, his pale eyes burning with a dark, fathomless intensity. "The ledger is clear. Now you manage my future. You manage my empire with your life." I stared at the heavy gold crest on my hand. The emptiness in my chest didn't just vanish. It was incinerated, replaced by a dark, consuming inferno. I wasn't a hostage. I wasn't a substitute. I was the consigliere of the most dangerous man in New York, and he was kneeling at the altar of my intellect. I didn't submit. I didn't cast my eyes down. I stood up, grabbed the heavy lapels of Victor's dark suit, and pulled him violently across the desk. Our lips collided. There was no sweetness in it. It was a clash of teeth, desperation, and power. It tasted of ash-black coffee and the intoxicating, lethal crackle of an electrical storm. Victor groaned, a deep primal sound that vibrated against my mouth, his large hands immediately coming up to grip my waist, lifting me completely off the ground. He kissed me like a starving man who had finally found the feast he was born for. And for the first time in my entire life, I kissed him back with all the venom and devotion of a monster who had finally found his home. The rain in New York always smelled the same, heavy, damp, and pulling the scent of wet asphalt and crushed leaves into the air. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the upstate estate holding a mug of bitter black coffee. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 6 months since I had been shoved into the back of a Maybach, wearing my brother's ill-fitting suit. I looked down at my left hand. The heavy gold signet ring of the consigliere caught the gray morning light. My fingers were still scarred from the diner grill, but they weren't trembling anymore. They were steady. They were lethal. I took a sip of my coffee, turning my back to the rain, and glared at the sprawling mahogany desk in the center of the room. My OCD was practically vibrating at the base of my skull. I marched back to the desk, slammed my mug down on a coaster, and picked up my red fountain pen. I stared at the ledger in front of me, a deep scowl etching itself onto my face. "Victor," I snapped. My voice echoed down the quiet, cavernous hallway of the mansion. 10 seconds later, heavy footsteps approached. Victor leaned against the doorframe of the study. He wasn't wearing his tailored Don suits or his Kevlar tactical gear. He wore a simple, dark gray Henley shirt that clung to the heavily scarred musculature of his chest and loose sweatpants. His dark hair was messy from sleep. He looked domestic, but it was a deceptive domesticity, like a sleeping panther resting on a silk rug. He took a slow sip from his own coffee mug, his pale, icy eyes entirely focused on me. The ambient scent of the room immediately shifted the heavy, crackling ozone wrapping around my own sharp scent of ink and ash. "Good morning to you too, Julian," Victor murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. "I see we are choosing violence before breakfast." "I am choosing basic accounting principles," I retorted, tapping the red nib of my pen aggressively against the expensive parchment. "Explain to me how you managed to write off $4.2 million in untraceable bearer bonds as miscellaneous logistics." Victor pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. A faint, dark smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I bought heavy artillery," Victor stated calmly, as if he were discussing buying milk at the grocery store. "The shipment arrived from the Serbians at 3:00 a.m. We needed to restock the armories in Brooklyn." "I don't care if you bought a nuclear submarine, Victor." I threw my hands up in sheer frustration. "You cannot leave a $4 million hole in a quarterly financial report. Do you know what that does to my payout margins? It throws the entire holding company into a 12% variance." "The Serbians deal in heavy machine guns," Julian, Victor reasoned, stopping right next to my chair. "They don't exactly provide itemized tax receipts." "Then you make them write one," I demanded, glaring up at the most feared alpha on the eastern seaboard. "I am not balancing the syndicate's books with sticky notes and guesswork. The next time you buy illegal military-grade hardware, you get a damn invoice, or I am freezing your personal discretionary fund." Victor stared down at me. The silence stretched in the study. Any other man in the syndicate would have had his tongue cut out for speaking to the Don this way. Instead, the dark amusement in Victor's eyes deepened into something entirely feral and intensely possessive. He reached out, taking the red pen from my hand, and gently tossed it onto the desk. Before I could protest, Victor gripped the armrests of my chair, trapping me in, and leaned down. His large, calloused hand cupped the back of my neck, his thumb resting directly over my defective scent gland. "You are going to cut off my allowance," Victor whispered, his breath ghosting over my jaw. "I run the money." I whispered back, my heart rate accelerating, the anger instantly melting into a dark, thrilling heat. "You are just the muscle." Victor let out a low, vibrating growl of laughter. It was a rare, beautiful sound. He leaned in and kissed the side of my neck, right over the pulsing vein. He breathed in deeply, inhaling the harsh, bitter scent of ash that he had come to worship. "My beautiful, terrifying accountant," Victor murmured against my skin, his lips trailing up to my jawline. "You can freeze my funds all you want. I sign the master deeds. Remember, I am officially your most expensive hostage." I tilted my head back, giving him better access, my hands coming up to grip the soft fabric of his shirt. The emptiness that had haunted me my entire life was completely gone. I wasn't a spare part. I wasn't a hostage pretending to be a sweet, pliable Omega. I was a monster who had found his equal. We didn't have a normal marriage. Our love language consisted of balanced spreadsheets, suppressed gunfire, and absolute unquestioned loyalty. Victor pulled back slightly, looking down into my eyes. The violent storm in his gaze was anchored entirely to me. "Leave the ledger for an hour." Victor ordered softly, his thumb tracing my lower lip. "The Serbians can wait. My consigliere has overworked himself." I looked at the scattered papers, the red ink, and the absolute power resting at my fingertips. I didn't need to run. I didn't need to hide. I had built a fortress out of numbers, and the devil himself was guarding the door. I smiled. It was a cynical, sharp expression that belonged entirely to a Vance who had won the game. 1 hour. I agreed, pulling him down by the collar of his shirt. "Then you are getting me a receipt." As his lips crashed into mine, tasting of black coffee and ozone, I realized something fundamental about my existence. Blood doesn't smell like copper. It never did. It smells like old coins left out in the rain. But as I sat in my bulletproof estate, wearing the gold ring of the Cross Syndicate, I finally found peace in that metallic scent. Because now, every single one of those blood-soaked coins in New York City was safely locked inside my vault.